Okay, thank you everyone for coming, and I'm going to tell you all about the Georgian Child Support Agency, and we're going to also sort of try and reflect on how it might compare to modern society. Okay, so if we're thinking about modern society, since we're thinking about how much this might be a topical talk, the Child Support Agency actually doesn't exist anymore, but it's a nice handy way of thinking about getting maintenance from parents in late 20th, early 21st century society. It was replaced in 2012. So it was a Child Support Agency before 2012, and then it was replaced in 2012 by the Child Maintenance Service. And you've got a graph here of a fairly recent, up to December 2018, graph of the amount that they were able to recover from parents. So this collect and pay service is what this new maintenance service provides. And this was if parents cannot arrange payments between themselves, or they do not pay what was agreed. At that point, the collect and pay service steps in, and I think they take a cut too, don't they? There's been some dispute over the amount that the service say costs to run. So we could think about that historically as well. So you can see from this, in 2017, it was 57% of the money was recovered, and in 2018, it had risen slightly to 66%. So we might want to think of that as our benchmark when we're maybe going to think about how much they managed to recover in the past. Okay, now this is to give you some historical context about rates of illegitimacy, because most of what we're going to talk about with the Child Support Agency of the Georgian period was to do with illegitimate children, and I'll explain a bit more about that in a moment. So the first piece of legislation, what are called, put in quotation marks, the bastardy laws, started in 1576. So you've got that little blue arrow there that shows you the how high illegitimacy was, and you can see it was rising up to 1576 and thereafter, actually, when they passed the first piece of legislation to try and recover the costs of illegitimate children from their parents. You can then see there was a decline, and then for much of the period we're going to talk about today, that very steady rise in illegitimacy from about 1650 all the way up until the second red arrow, which is around 1850. Now, they radically changed the poor laws, which is the Child Support Agency of the past was part of the poor laws, in 1834, and we're not really going to reflect too much on that because they changed it so much, but we can in the Q&A if you want to ask some questions about that. And then to give you some idea, that big peak in 1850 is roughly the same as in the 1960s and 70s. So I think we like to think in the past there probably weren't very many illegitimate children, and we think of the past as being very all like the Victorian period, when illegitimacy was actually relatively low. You can see it declined after 1850. So for much of the Victorian period, it was going down, but it was actually relatively high and growing, rising over the period that we're thinking about here. Now, the bastardy laws and what was called the process of affiliation offered overseers of the poor a unique way to recover the costs of one group of the poor. So it made parents financially liable for their children. So this would be parents of illegitimate children, as we'll see, largely putative fathers, but also husbands and fathers who deserted their families. So if you were a married woman and your husband deserted you, you could recover the costs of the maintenance of children through the same process, through these sort of bastardy laws and the process of affiliation. And there are affiliation orders in the past to do with the desertion of wives and children as well. Now, these bastardy laws we saw that it was 1576 onwards. There was another one in 1609 to 10, 1662, 1733, 1809 and 1810. So quite a lot of legislation was passed in the period that we're thinking about here to do with the recovery of maintenance for illegitimate children. Now, there was an act, the Act of 1576 specified that the parents of bastards now being left to be kept at the charge of the parish where they be born were financially responsible rather than the parish ratepayers. So local taxpayers didn't want to have to pay for the maintenance of illegitimate children. They now wanted to push this rising cost back onto the parents. So both parents were put under an obligation for the payment of money weekly or other sustentation for the relief of such child. And this is what was called chargeable bastardy. So illegitimate children who were likely to become chargeable upon the parish. And that, so it's poor children on the whole, not those of monarchs or highborn aristocratic men. It's aimed at those who are poor, who might become dependent on what we think of today as state benefits. It's that group of people that they're trying to recover the costs from. So how did they establish who came under this law in the past, and how did they establish who were the putative fathers of illegitimate children? So women came before they could be examined as to who the putative father of their child was 3 times. So the first was before birth. They would come before 2 magistrates, during birth itself, and then again after birth, because of course before birth the child isn't chargeable because it hasn't been born. So you would try and establish who the father was before the birth. You'll check during delivery, and we'll talk about that again in a minute. And then the whole process of going before the 2 magistrates will be repeated again after birth. Now the child is actually chargeable. So this gives you an example of what are called bastardy examinations. There's also settlement examinations. This is to work out which parish was responsible for the child. So you'd have a settlement, i.e. the parish that's responsible for you. And at the same time, Rebecca Clements, she would have been examined for her settlement parish as well as who the father of this child was. Now, this was also important because illegitimate children took as a parish of settlement the parish they were born in, not of their mother or the putative father. Whereas married women, their children took the settlement of the father. So this was an important difference for unmarried parents. This is why it generated so much bureaucracy and paperwork for us to, as historians, look behind at now. So this one's taken before birth for Rebecca Clements in Middlesex. And you can see here, she's come before the magistrates, the voluntary examination of Rebecca Clements, single woman, she's 21, taken upon oath before me, Peter Ellers, Esquire. So he's the magistrate. It was supposed to be 2, but as you can see here, it was only 1, and that seemed to be quite frequent in practice. This examinant, on her oath, says that she's pregnant of a bastard child or children, because it could be twins, which was or were unlawfully begotten on her body. So this was fornication outside marriage, which was against ecclesiastical law, by one Mr. John Custos, a jeweller who now lodges at a house in Tibbles Road near Red Lion Square, London, and says that he had carnal knowledge of her body the first time about 2 years ago at the Angel Inn behind St Clement's Church, London, and several times after at the said inn, and particularly about 8 months ago at a house known by the sign of the Cheshire Cheese, near the creek adjoining to Chelsea, in the said county of Middlesex. And this examinant further says that the said John Custos is the true father of the said child or children when born, and further saith not, and then her mark on that she had sworn to this. Okay, so this gives you some idea. This is a pictorial representation of what it was like to give one of these examinations, and this is a Hogarth etching called Woman Swearing a Child to a Grave Citizen. So in 1733, one of those pieces of legislation that I mentioned, this process of affiliation was described and specified. So it said, any single woman who shall be delivered of a bastard child, which shall be chargeable or likely to become chargeable, i.e. she might, with her child, become chargeable at some point on the parish needing their financial assistance, was to be brought by parish officials to be examined on oath before 2 magistrates, where she was to charge any person with having gotten her with child. And the putative father was to give security to indemnify such parish, i.e. to provide the money so that the parish wouldn't have to pay for the child. Okay, so now Hogarth is playing upon concerns here with the Georgian Child Support Agency. So this is the pregnant, heavily pregnant, unmarried mother coming to court before the magistrate. Again, we can see it's just the one, to swear who the father was before she gave birth, and she's got her hand there on the Bible. Now, this is the putative father. This is the man who's being accused of being the father of the child. And this is his wife. So you can see why he's got his hands up saying, it wasn't me, God, nothing to do with me, and his wife remonstrating with him. So this must have played on lots of fears within contemporary society of married men getting unmarried women who wasn't the woman who wasn't their wife pregnant. And so he's the very grave citizen in this picture, but this here in the circle is the actual father. So again, we've got another contemporary concern that women could be put up to swearing the legitimacy, the paternity of the father of their unborn child by the real father against another man, maybe who might have more money and ability to pay, and it would mean that the actual father got off scot-free. And this was something that they did worry about in contemporary society, and was partly behind the overhauling of the poor laws in 1834 and the bastardy clauses of those. So this is our first examination. So the woman's gone before the magistrates for the first time to swear who the putative father is before she gives birth. Now, they also asked again during birth. So a midwife, when she took out her license, got her license from the ecclesiastical authority, she had to swear an oath that she would ask an unmarried mother who the putative father was during labour. And you can see this here. So we've got an example of the midwife who would ask during labour who the father was. So it's believed that at the point of most pain during labour, women couldn't lie, and the midwife would say that she wouldn't assist until the unmarried mother told her who the real father was. And so she would ask again then. So we've got this example here of 1695 Mary Raven. So in the extremity of her travel, in the most pain of labour, she was asked who the father was. So the justice heard diverse other pregnant proofs and circumstances upon oath. So this was the evidence that they also heard from witnesses that Mary Raven had been courting Hugh Hunter, who was the father of her child. They said that these the evidence provided to the court was sufficiently convincing that they placed an order on Hunter until the child was aged 12, for and towards the keeping and education of the same child. And this was of 2 shillings and 6pence, as well as £5 from him for an apprenticeship when the child turned 12, and a bond of £40 in case he defaulted, at which point the bond would be called in as the £40 if he hadn't provided that other money. Okay, so when they're thinking about who the kind of evidence that they would hear about paternity, what sort of evidence did they hear in these courts? And we've got some evidence here from London. So in St Clement Danes in 1739, there was a summons against John Graham to attend a meeting for the justices to show cause why he should not be adjudged the reputed father of a male bastard child born on the body of Eleanor Monk, single woman. So she'd had a child by then, and he was summoned to call to say why he wasn't the father. But he could persuade the justices why he wasn't the father at that point. And then another one here in 1709. So upon the examination of the said Sarah Fisher, mother of the said male bastard child, and other convincing circumstances, no, hereunto moving, do hereby adjudge and declare the said Robert Newbery to be the reputed father. Now that doesn't give it that tells us that the magistrates were convinced by the evidence that was provided them in court. We know from the work of other historians this was pretty rigorous kinds of information, corroborative evidence that was provided. So we've got a bit more detail in this one. So St George the Martyr in Southwark in 1809, William Langstaff, he besmirched the character of the woman who had named him as the putative father. So he said, "It was long before I knew her, her character was such that no modest female would be seen with her. Her house was the rendezvous for all the young men in the town. I have seen 3 or 4 in her bedroom at a time, and have known her being out all hours of the night with different men. She would give them liquor, then take them to her bedroom. And yet this lecherous woman, no doubt, has made a very plausible story. I know her capable of anything. If she was in distress, economic distress, there would be some excuse for her. but she is supported by almost the whole of her relations, who are in affluent circumstances. By many of them, she has been persuaded to swear, who I had offended on account of my refusing to marry her. They therefore are determined to distress me as much as possible. So he was saying this was the reason why he had been put up as the putative father, and that she had sworn paternity of him, even though it was unlikely that he was the father. However, sometimes magistrates were worried about that kind of evidence besmirching women's character so that men might get out of paying, even though they might be the father, for instance. So we've got some more evidence here. So Chelmsford and Essex, the Court of Petty Sessions, that's the lowest court, in 1822, Leonard Goodeve. Now you can see here, again, that worry about who the actual father is. So after portraying the woman as a common prostitute, this was the putative father in court, on account of her having had one child before, so she's already got one illegitimate child, he admitted she was his servant for 3 or 4 years. And at the time of gendering the child, that she and him had both agreed that she should admit one of the workmen, i.e. rather than the real father, Denny, to her favours in order, if there was a child produced, to impose it on him. And then there was another case that stands out from St Luke's, Hannah Bradley. She was a servant in the household in which Thomas Lee, an attorney's clerk in the Rolls Office in Chancery Lane, lodged. When she went to see him at work, heavily pregnant and requesting help with the expenses of her lying in, this is what he said to her. He answered, if one single halfpenny would save her and the child, he would not give it to her, and pushed her out of his office. So this is the kind of evidence that then came out in court. Now, magistrates were very aware of trying to work out who the actual father was. You can see here with the Chelmsford one that they managed to actually work out that this man, Leonard Goodeve, was the actual father rather than Denny, and that they were always worried about these kinds of issues when they were trying to work out who the father was. Now, if an order was made against the father to provide maintenance, and he didn't think he was the father, he wanted to appeal, he was always allowed to appeal. So he could come back to petty sessions, back to the magistrates with other evidence if he thought he had wrongfully been asked to pay the maintenance of a child. Okay, so this process of affiliation we're going to talk about now, which was this process of the Georgian Child Support Agency from not just Georgian, but from 1576 onwards. But this is the period we're going to look at. This is the period that I have researched. So what kind of money were they likely to ask for back from the father? And we're going to look at these in a bit more detail in a minute. So one was the expenses to do with childbirth, the lying in, the midwife, any medical care, and then all the legal costs associated with running all of these court cases, drawing up bastardy bonds, drawing up affiliation orders. The man might be asked to pay a lump sum up front. And then the other system was whereby a bond was provided. Usually the father put up the bond along with 2 or 3 other, usually men, and that would be called in. So the money wasn't actually there, but you would promise the money if the man defaulted on paying a weekly amount. And then affiliation order would be put in place for weekly maintenance from the father. Okay, so what sorts of amounts might they have been asking back from putative fathers? Now, this is Lyle's work from 2005, and she looked at the amounts awarded to mothers. It says 1832, but it was through a parliamentary paper, a survey that was taken between 1827 and 1832. And these were the sums across the country that were asked for by the father, from the father. So you can see there's quite a geography to it. And that much higher sums were asked for in the southeast, partly across that sort of Midlands belt, and then to the west and to Norfolk and Cornwall, it was and Wales, it was lower. So that gives us one sense of a geography and the kinds of amounts that were requested to be paid back. Now, another study by Thomas Nutt, he looked at this same parliamentary paper from 1827 to 32, and he found that the amount they managed to recover, what he called the varsity recovery rate, so the amount of money they recouped from fathers, was much higher in the north than in the south. So it's 83% in the north and only 41% in the south. Now, my work is on London, and London was the worst at getting the money back. So the varsity recovery rate that Tom Nutt found, you can see here for the Middlesex parishes, it was nearly 30%. For the City of London without the walls, outside of the walls, was 24%, and the city within the walls was only about 18%. So that's about a fifth to less than a third of the money they managed to recover from fathers. Okay, so I'm going to summarise now what I found in my research for my book, and this is on London rather than all of the UK, and much of it from South London, from Southwark and from Lambeth. Okay, so now I mentioned before the kinds of expenses that they wanted back from the fathers. So the childbirth costs, initial maintenance, clothing for the infant. Fathers are expected to pay funeral costs if the child died, legal fees that we've mentioned, warrants, serving warrants upon fathers, those two varsity examinations, one before and one after birth, the order if it was made against the father, inquiring after securities, vestry clerks' attendants, beadles, messengers, discharging bonds, letter costs. So all of that might be asked for back from fathers, and this gives you some sense of the amount that was asked for, how much it came to and how much they asked for back. So you can see that the most common sum was £1 or £2, so not terribly high. But you can also see, and actually it doesn't show up because of it's a logarithmic scale, but you can see that very final one on the X, £15 to £21. You can't see that there was somebody there, but there was one man, and he was asked for £20, 10 shillings and 6pence. So it could be a very significant sum indeed. Now, we've also got lump sums that were paid in St George the Martyr in Southwark. This information was recorded, and the number of men that were asked to pay lump sums. So you might pay a lump sum, and this meant all further claims on them were discharged. Now, Jonas Hanway, who was a reformer in 18th century London, he disapproved of lump sums because he thought this contributed towards the high mortality rates of illegitimate children, because it removes the incentive to keep them alive. We might speculate that a lump sum might be less than paying a weekly maintenance for years and years and years and years, and that fathers might have decided that they would rather pay a lump sum up front and be discharged from any further responsibilities. And in fact, what I actually found was it was the poorest men, or those that were a flight risk and were likely to default. These were the men that they didn't trust, and they asked for the money up front. And in fact, 30% of men paying these lump sums had been jailed until they agreed to do so. And that masters, fathers, friends all had to contribute towards these lump sums. So it's more likely that they were very poor, or they were likely to desert. So John Ivory's master, for instance, Mr. Wrench, paid his lump sum of £21. So you can see here the most common lump sum was £20 to £29, but quite a few were paying £50 to £59. Now, you remember here we were looking at the sums ordered, and we've got 1 shilling and 6pence and below, between 1 shilling and 6pence and 2 shillings, and then 2 shillings and above. And you can, those black dots are the 2 shillings and above. So there's a lot of those. And Tom Nutt also found, when he looked at this survey I've mentioned, that the most common amount ordered was 2 shillings and 6pence. Okay, so what did I find when I looked at London? And this gives you a variety of parishes that I looked at. So it turns out that most were ordered to pay 2 shillings and 6pence. So that was true. But If you actually count the number of men who were asked to pay more than 2 shillings and sixpence, so the 3 shillings right up there to the 10 shillings, it's far higher. So far more men, in fact, paid more than the most common sum, right up to 10 shillings. 50 men paid 2 shillings and sixpence, but 273 men were actually ordered to pay more. Now, women might also be asked to pay. This was fairly rare. In about 4% of cases, an affiliation order was taken out over to a woman, and she was asked to pay. And this was between 6p a week and 5 shillings. Now, how long did men have to pay for? Now, we've seen what they were ordered to pay. So this is what they were ordered to pay on those affiliation orders. Now, for how long might they be expected to pay for? This is the duration of payments. Now, you can see in St George the Martyr between 1792 and 1808, it only went up to 7. And this was the age at nurture, at which point a child might be separated from their mother. So you can see there that they're only asking them maybe to pay till 7. But then in St Mary Newington, up to 1835, you can see that quite a few people, few men, might be paying until a child was 15. So that's twice as long. However, these payments here, this is the actual amount of time these payments were paid for. The books that I looked in didn't tell you who was doing the paying. So the parish, if a father was ordered to pay an amount and then he defaulted, the parish had to continue to pay that amount either until 7 years or until 15 years. So from those books, it's not entirely apparent who is actually doing the paying. But we do know that those illegitimate children were maintained for all of that time by somebody, either the putative father or the parish. Now, it's important because, of course, if a putative father defaults, the parish has to take up the tab. So how did they try and get fathers to pay and mothers? I mentioned jailing before. So this was one option if a father was refusing to pay, if he could afford to pay, but was refusing. Now, a woman could go to the House of Corrections, this is an early jail, for lewdness. And for having an illegitimate child. Also, if she refused to name the father, if she falsely swore the wrong father, so that picture we saw from Hogarth, if she was falsely swearing, and in that court case that we mentioned with Denny, the workman, if she falsely swore to the wrong man, she could be sent to a House of Correction for doing so. So there were legal consequences. And also if she couldn't maintain her own child. Now, men could not be sent to the House of Correction for lewdness, but they could be for refusal and sometimes inability to provide securities and maintenance. So this is one case here. Benjamin Lucas, he was committed by B. Tilliard Esquire, the magistrate, charged on oath and his own confession of begetting Elizabeth Valston with child of a bastard child, which born in the hamlet of Spitalfields, and which has been and is chargeable to the said hamlet and refusing to give sufficient security. What was it like in these houses of correction? Now, Hogarth did another wonderful etching for us, A Harlot's Progress. And this is when the harlot, who is a high-class prostitute, ends up in Bridewell in London, in the House of Correction. You can see there, she's holding what's called a beetle. It's a very heavy hammer, and she's beating hemp, and she might do that for 10 or 12 hours a day. You can also see people in the stocks there. So it was unpleasant to end up in one of these houses of correction. But how many people actually went to the House of Correction? Just because it named it in law didn't mean that it was done routinely. So we've got a graph here of the number of men and women committed to 3 houses of correction. There are only 3 in London: Bridewell in the City, Middlesex and Westminster houses of correction for bastardy offences. You can see it was actually very high in the early 17th century, but thereafter very low. And certainly by the 18th century, they are not routinely sending men or women to these houses of correction to get them to pay. Very small numbers. Now, Dobblevala, he's got a book on the first the first sexual revolution, which he puts in the 18th century. And he says it's the lack of this kind of moral policing that leads to this sexual revolution by the 18th century. But any sexual revolution might be one for men only, a liberty sexual revolution, which favoured men over women and literally left women holding the baby. Okay, now this is another house of correction later, one for Brixton in the early 19th century, so in Southwark, and this gives you an idea of what it might be like if you were on the treadmill. 1/5 of fathers in St George the Martyr in Southwark in the early 19th century were jailed in Brixton or Kingston houses of correction, and this was for want of sureties, for not putting up the money, or refusal to pay. So 4/5 it was refusing to pay, and they would be sentenced for 3 months. So David Byron, for instance, he was committed to the House of Correction in Brixton for refusal to pay the bastardy expenses for his child Alfred with Susanna Turrell. But, and it literally said this in the books, it said he got sick of the mill and paid the bill. So he got sick of being on this treadmill here, walking with all these other men, grinding corn or drawing water, and he coughed up and paid. It worked. But he then fled to America, so he was a flight risk, and he left 5 illegitimate children behind, obviously then falling on the ratepayers, local ratepayers. Okay, so the Georgian Child Support Agency, was it a success or a failure? To wrap up and to conclude, we've seen that in the 1820s and 1830s, London had very poor rates of recovery. So between 18 and 30% of the money was recovered from fathers. We saw that in modern society now, it's at the moment about 66%, about 2/3. But actually, modern society only comes somewhere in the middle, because in the north, in 1827 to 32, they were much better at getting the money back. They got about, as Tom Nutt showed, they got 83% of the money back. So I think it's definitely one of fair success, or maybe we might want to think how successful are we now at managing to recover the money. Okay, that's me all done. Thank you very much, and thanks for coming.